Hello, and welcome to Uncertain Forecast, a podcast about climate justice brought to you by the California Center for Ethics and Policy in the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences at Cal Poly Pomona. My name is Alex Madva, and as director of the California Center for Ethics and Policy, or CCEP, and on behalf of the CCEP faculty fellows co-organizing Uncertain Forecast, namely Nicole Lambrew, Brady Collins, and Corey Aragon, we are pleased to bring you our second panel on climate justice. First, I'd like to encourage you to visit our website, and we're putting the link in the chat now, where you can sign up for our mailing list and stay in the know about all our upcoming events. And you can also follow us on all the socials, so we hope to see you there. We're excited to be offering a full lineup of events this spring. We have a recording of our first event from January on California wildfires and climate justice, which you can find in the chat. And please mark these two further dates down in your calendar. Next, on Friday, March 18th, from 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. Pacific, we'll host Just Air, California, Health, and the Ethics of Repair. Our March panel will explore the history of air pollution, and we'll discuss policies to address it, including mitigation measures for reducing pollution from various industry sectors, and we'll look at what these policies mean for communities most impacted by low air quality and toxic pollutants. It will also explore the relationship between our built environment and human health, and will address pressing questions about the ethics of repair and recovery. So you can go to a website that we've just dropped in the chat to register there and see our exciting list of panelists. Finally, on Friday, April 15th, also from 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m., we'll host Soil, Food, and Justice, the Ecosystems of California, which will explore the effects of soil depletion on California's ecosystems and food production. And lastly, don't forget to catch up on season 1 of CCEP's podcast, Securing Justice, which focused on California housing insecurity and which you can find anywhere you get your podcasts. Today's panel is It's California, Jake, Power, Water, and the Golden State. Our moderator is Nicole Lambrew, whose work focuses on the politics of climate resilience and how they inform urban environmental transformations. Nicole is an architect, urban designer, and researcher with experience in designing and building initiatives for public space. She is pursuing a PhD in urban planning from UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs, and her current research looks at how exposure, social vulnerability, and adaptive capacity of populations facing wildfire risk in California are assessed. So without further ado, let me hand the virtual mic over to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Alex. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to our esteemed panelists for taking the time to join us today. I do want to start with a very brief framing of water that we've been talking about in our offline conversations, our respective research, and also with our students. Water is, of course, a topic that is too large to cover in a few sentences. It touches on a number of critical issues that range from water quality, use, access and affordability, and infrastructure. And these issues are not specific to California, of course, but affect the country as a whole. So for the purposes of this particular panel, we're interested in the intersection of water with climate change, right? So maintenance costs that are beyond the budgets of many state agencies and institutions, and are expected to increase given extreme weather events and their impact on the already aging infrastructure underpinning our waterways, for example. So attempting to make these water systems more climate adaptive impacts populations differently, of course, and tracing both everyday struggles and also longer term endeavors that require collective action towards equitable access to such a fundamental resource as water is equally important to bring to light. And while California has recognized water as a human right, it has not materialized that promise, let's say through things like funding. So the format for the session is to have more or less around 15 minutes for each panelist to present an aspect of their work on water with us, followed by a number of questions that they can pose to each other or take from the audience. So please, if you have questions, as you have them, just post them in the chat and we'll moderate those as they come in. So with that, I have the absolute pleasure of introducing our first panelist, Greg Pierce. Dr. Pierce is the co-director of the Luskin Center for Innovation and the director of the Human Right to Water Solutions Lab with the center. Sorry, it's hard to breathe in the mask. He is the co-director of the UCLA Water Resource Group within the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, IOES at UCLA, and also serves as an adjunct assistant professor at UCLA's Department of Urban Planning and faculty affiliate at the Center for Healthy Climate Solutions in the Fielding School of Public Health. So has his presence everywhere. Dr. Pierce's research, teaching, and service is motivated by persistent inequities in access to the essential environmental services that we need to survive and thrive, water among them. He examines how infrastructure planning and policy efforts either perpetuate or facilitate inequities and demonstrates how communities strategically cope with and overcome those inequities. And his primary focus is on water insecurity, but he also examines solutions to cross-cutting green infrastructure, climate resilience, and broader transport insecurities. He has secured more than 25 extramural research funding awards as a principal investigator at UCLA's Luskin Center of Innovation, has authored or co-authored more than 40 peer-reviewed articles, including many in leading journals in urban studies, and received a PhD in urban planning in 2015 and an MA in urban planning in 2011, both from UCLA. We're grateful to have him with us today. Greg, thank you so much for taking the time to be here and to speak with our Cal Poly Pomona community, and I'll turn things over to you now.
All right, thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Alex, and everyone for joining. And I'm going to go ahead and get my slides up and running here. But yes, hello again. Thank you for the introduction. I'll just say simply, my name's Greg Pierce, and representing the Luskin Center primarily, but several other units on campus. I'm going to try to keep my remarks, fairly brief and really focus in on one issue that we've studied quite extensively, which is drinking water system fragmentation and its consequences, particularly for equity. This comes in a much larger stream of research that we do that's particularly motivated by achieving the human right to water. And we have done and continue to do a lot of work with the state and local agencies, nonprofits, community-based organizations, particularly within California, but also now branching out across the US to achieve the human right to water, which I will use sort of California's legislated definition around a human right to water, which is that water be safe and clean, affordable and accessible for everyone who lives here. As Nicole mentioned, we have not achieved that in California. We are not too close right now, although I would also say California is unique in having a legislated human right to water. The US is not a party to international sort of declarations around the human right to water, and California is easily doing the most on trying to achieve the human right to water if you look nationally. But the main point, or then there's really two main points I want to make. The first is that drinking water systems, and really this, I'm going to show you data mostly from LA and some from California, but this really applies across the US. Drinking water system governance is fragmented, and that has negative consequences, particularly for equity. So this is showing you basically the outline or the contours of drinking water system fragmentation in LA County. The technical term used is community water systems, if you're talking about EPA definitions. But the upshot of this is that there's 200 individual drinking water systems operating in LA County, and they really come in all different shapes and sizes, from Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which is a city-run utility serving 4 million people, to mobile home parks that are serving 25 people. Each of these are treated in largely similar ways from a regulatory perspective, but these different types of systems have vastly different capabilities, resources, and interests, frankly, in achieving a human right to water. And again, this is showing you LA. We have 200 drinking water systems. In California, the number's around 3,000, and nationally, it's around 50,000. And I do want to emphasize that drinking water system fragmentation is much more profound than what we see across other utility spaces. It really doesn't correspond to coherent administrative boundaries, environmental objectives, efficiency objectives, or equity objectives, although I'll be focusing on the equity objectives here. And the first objective that you see sort of most profoundly coming from drinking water system fragmentation is that there are large gaps in water quality and failure to comply with the basic water quality standards we have under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is what this SDWA acronym on the screen means. And we've done a lot of work, particularly with the state, and this slide is coming from work we have done with the state on how to identify systems that are failing, how to identify solutions, how to pay for them. That really just took things to a new level in this last year called the Drinking Water Needs Assessment. But the main thing I want to emphasize here is that the vast majority of violations, over 90% of water quality violations, occur in water systems serving less than 500 connections. And again, we have a lot of very small water systems, including in urban areas like LA. I think we have around 80 of these systems. But again, I also want to emphasize that this is not just an LA phenomenon, and this is showing you among the small systems across the state, organized by county, different levels of risk of falling out of water quality compliance. And you'll see that even though LA has among the largest, among the highest number of systems, of course, it's the largest county by population in the state, it's not actually at the extreme end of having vulnerable systems. And there are other counties, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, that have even more extreme fragmentation and more small systems in particular that are failing to provide high quality water. Fragmentation also has accessibility implications, and I think really this is vividly illustrated during the current drought as well as the last drought. And of course, we're always structurally in the drought, but I'll say acute drought. We could debate those terms if you want. But I think the sort of accessibility or the availability of water resources perpetuated inequalities across system size is only going to become more of a concern, particularly in urban areas, as larger systems that are most sophisticated and have the resources are able to invest in more local water supplies and shift away from imported water. But the smaller systems, particularly in LA County, for instance, the northern end of the county, as well as the southeast portion of the county that are reliant on relatively small systems, are not able to make those same investments and are historically reliant exclusively or primarily on groundwater. They're not able to get access to recycled water, enhanced stormwater investments, other types of emerging supplies, unless there's a change in progressive policy. And then the last thing I really want to highlight, this is, yeah, I could talk about this all day. And I think this is most surprising, and there's different ways to illustrate it, is that there are profound differences in how much people pay for water, depending on which water system they're served by. And again, spread out, fragmented across the 200 systems in LA County, for instance. And each of those systems, depending on what type of system they are, may have some regulatory oversight on how much they charge customers, but others have none. And water systems, even if you're a neighbor living on one side of the street versus another side of the street, you could be paying a huge difference depending on which system you're served by. This is illustrating to you actually within cities, there's also fragmentation of water systems. It's not that if you live in a city versus unincorporated, you're definitely going to be served by the city. There's quite a few cities in LA County where you have 5+ water providers, including, I would note, a few on the list here are quite close to Pomona. But that can lead to, for instance, I think the most profound difference here is in the city of Norwalk, where for the same amount of water, you could be paying anywhere, depending on where you live within the city of Norwalk, you could be paying between $31 and $102 for that same quantity. The differences when you look across the county are even more profound. And of course, when you look across the state are enormous. Although I would say within cities and within counties, you can make a pretty easy normative argument that the price should be relatively equal. And if we think about notions of right to the city, especially, and urban basic services that cities are supposed to provide, then the inequity is even more stark. And this is also a concern because water affordability, as opposed to quality and accessibility, hasn't been as high on the agenda, partly because water prices have historically been low. And now we're seeing what looks to be an inevitable rise in the price of water overall, which is somewhat necessary, but the inequities, depending on which system you're served by, will only increase, again, barring additional intervention. But I really want to stop here and just highlight also that we have done a lot more work than I'm showing you here in the space, and we just launched through the Human Right to Water Solutions Lab a map of basically all the data I just showed you that you can play around with, download, analyze. And we're also doing more work now at looking at the inequities in the actual sort of leadership across different water systems, including representation and accountability issues that fall outside the traditional sort of bounds of human right to water outcomes, but are which could be construed as distributional equity outcomes, but the procedural equity and decision-making opportunities in water planning are also mediated again by water system types. And particularly there's differences across whether a water system is run by a city versus an investor-owned utility versus, again, something like a mobile home park that really affect people's experiences and need to be addressed to realize the human right to water. But with that, I want to conclude and looking forward to the discussion later on.
Great, thank you, Greg. It's quite stunning to see how much fragmentation in the governance of water there is and its implications on equity in terms of both quality and affordability. If you can drop that link in the chat, that would be great for our audience to access. Thank you. So I'm going to turn next to Sadie Randall. Dr. Randall is an ethnographer, political ecologist, and research scientist with the Urban Water Innovation and Sustainability Hub at Texas A&M AgriLife Stala Center. And she previously held postdoc fellowships at UC Berkeley and USC, so close to us, and received her PhD from Yale's combined degree program in environmental studies and anthropology. Dr. Randall's research program explores the spatial and cultural politics of urban climate adaptation with a geographic focus on the arid US West. She specifically studies how attempts to make critical infrastructural systems more quote unquote climate resilient transform material flows in urban lives, rearranging labor and power across the extended metropolitan landscape in the process. Her work highlights both the intimate and systemic effects of these initiatives with an emphasis on their environmental justice impacts. Dr. Randall's work has been published in a number of highly regarded peer-reviewed journals and in other fora of public scholarship. I've been following her work for several years now. Sadie, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure seeing you again and having you here with us today to share some of your important work. I'll hand the stage over to you now. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that introduction, Nicole. And thanks also to Greg for a really fantastic presentation preceding this one. I think it's a nice compliment because I'm going to be focusing on how within a single very large water utilities area, there can be really radically uneven impacts of efforts to secure the water supply for a climate change future. So today I'm going to talk mostly about the San Fernando groundwater basin, which was really an object of focus for me during my dissertation fieldwork. Yeah. And I found myself often having conversations with folks who worked for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power that sounded a lot like the quotes here. Things that they would say talking about the basin would be, for us, that's a storage tank that's sitting empty, or suggesting that they really need to hold water for a future drought within the San Fernando basin. So coming into these conversations, I have to admit, storage, holding water, the basin in general had not so much been my focus. As with a lot of people thinking about the city of LA's water story, I was really focused on flows, particularly the enormous aqueducts that come into the city. Roughly 90% of LA's water, the city of LA's water supply comes from beyond its borders. And I've always been interested in how these kinds of movements of water just really shape the way that landscapes and political economy and social relations emerge. But thinking with these efforts to kind of treat the basin as a new sort of stockpile, which are being accelerated by the anticipated impacts of global climate change, really helped me understand the growing importance and kind of shifting role of storage and storage spaces within the California waterscape. Now, when you hear the word storage in association with water, probably dams like this, which is the classic, the Hoover Dam, are what come to mind. But as the, okay, there we go. As starting my talk about the San Fernando Basin suggests, we're in a moment where actually subterranean spaces are emerging as a sort of new object of governance and a new target as spots where cities and other entities are really trying to stockpile water. And so my talk today is going to look at like one dimension of how that's not only shifting where the water is and when, but also the kind of above ground impacts that can have in one context. Okay, so this water supply timeline is sort of helpful to get us all on the same page of where the city of LA's aqueduct and kind of flows story comes together. Since 1913, when the LA Aqueduct initially started its deliveries to the city, the majority of City of LA's water supply has come from beyond its borders. However, from that time onward, the city also relied on a reservoir network to modulate the flows within that system. And this, unfortunately, is a photo of the city's most famous failed reservoir, which stood about 20 miles northeast of the city behind the St. Francis Dam, which tragically failed in 1928. I put this image here primarily to help understand why many of us don't think of reservoirs when we think of LA, because since this failure, by and large, the city has focused its storage infrastructure hundreds of miles away from the boundaries of LA, up in the Owens Valley, where a lot of its water comes from. However, while we can talk about, a city or an irrigation district or another entity really relying on built up infrastructural storage like a reservoir, within California, the biggest reservoir was not built by anyone. It is a Sierra Nevada snowpack. And I've always loved the image I have on the left side of my screen here, which kind of shows just how much of California's water infrastructure is built around that snowpack, which is what accumulates when high elevation snow comes. It melts slowly over the course of the months following the winter. And we really kind of built out and organized the way that our reservoirs, our flows, a lot of our arrangements, let's say, are dependent on a set of assumptions about the way this snowpack operates. Now, we saw a lot of these images back during the 2012 to 2017 drought, which kind of highlighted that when we were talking about that drought, it wasn't just that, oh, it's not raining in LA. It's largely structured by the fact that it was A, not snowing much in the Sierra, and B, because we were hitting record high temperatures. The melt was happening faster, there's more evaporation, and the water was not going through the system at the expected time. So kind of broadly, we might say that this represents the fact that the snowpack is just really no longer quite functioning in the way that we had built our system to rely on it. And climate modelers highlight the fact that we should be expecting more of this more intensely going forward, that we're going to have more and more dry, hot years. However, they've also demonstrated that we're likely to have more of these enormous kind of feast water years that our infrastructure is also not prepared for. This is a photo from 2017 when the Oroville Dam nearly failed because of this kind of snow feast and precipitation feast that was happening. And so I use this image just to highlight that it's not just going to be a shift in the volume of precipitation, it's going to be about the timing of that precipitation, when it's coming, where we can hold it. That's going to complicate operations moving forward. And so this is not something that's only sitting in my head. A lot of folks who work in water management entities across the state are well aware of these transitions. And there's kind of this growing focus on producing new arrangements of storage that aren't high mountain to help us be able to use what we can of the winter precipitation we get and store it for when we are not having much precipitation. And this is a case where there are future reservoirs that are potentially going to be built in the future, but a lot of these are very long, kind of decades delayed projects that cost billions of dollars. And so partially because of this political economy funding reality, and partially because it's understood that there's quite a lot of opportunity underneath California's surface in the form of its groundwater basins, many of which hold a lot less water than they used to. So yeah, what I was getting to is the subterranean space is emerging as a sort of new target for management and understood as an opportunity landscape for storing water. And I'll flag here that something I think my fellow panelists and most of you in the room understand well, an aquifer groundwater basin is a far more complex hydrological entity than a storage tank. What I'm trying to highlight is how this idea is something that a lot of really salient water managers in the state are sort of converging around and starting to orient their policy towards. And so this brings us back to the San Fernando Basin. And I've got a couple maps here that I think are sort of helpful. I think I flagged this earlier, but the San Fernando Basin has for a long time been a part of the city's water supply infrastructure. Roughly 8% of the city's annual water supply over the past 5 years was pumped up from this basin. The image that is less green has an indication of where some of these established pumping wells are. And it is a basin that's suffered from the impacts of pretty distributed pollution. And I can speak more about that if anybody would like to hear it in the question and answer. But for the purpose of this presentation, this is, as my interlocutors were expressing, increasingly seen as a site that's a little bit empty, but really has potential to be holding water for the city in the future to help keep it secure during times of drought. Now, part of the reason there's less water in this basin than there might be is the reality that land change within the lands overlying the basin, like much of the rest of this region, have really transformed in the past century. As you can see in this black and white photo, this used to be a lightly settled agricultural area. And by 2008, when the other image was taken, you can see there's been an influx of roads, of roofs, of lots of impervious surfaces. The kind of really salient thing here about having that transformation above a groundwater basin is that instead of rain and storm water kind of infiltrating into the landscape where it falls, it ends up sliding into the storm drains that we're all quite familiar with in Southern California and moving out to the Pacific Ocean rather than getting down into the groundwater basin. And so this growing consensus is that this is a sort of arrangement that needs to be shifted so LA can have this secure water stockpile within the San Fernando Basin. And a lot of the techniques that are discussed for it are what are called either green infrastructure or nature-based solutions. And these take many forms. I think that maybe Edgar in his presentation later on will talk about some of the larger scale, more industrial sort of recharge facilities that LA has some of in this area. But there's also growing attention to sort of more pervious, naturalized spaces that are woven into the urban fabric, focused on, let's say, parks, power line easements, street medians like this, and even individual residential parcels. And the idea is that rather than having concrete, which everything slides off of, or other kind of hard surfaces, you build in some terrain, you build in some plants, you build in a more naturalized space that helps the water get down, as a nice image on the right side of my screen indicates, and drip into the aquifer, which underlies these relatively rocky soiled areas. And so the city's stormwater capture master plan, initially drafted in 2015, and their subsequent sustainability plans both kind of foreground the focus on this approach to stormwater management. It's not the only piece of their water supply puzzle. It's not the only thing they're doing to try and adapt for climate change, but it is a priority to kind of spread these new nature-based solutions and get them into the ground above the basin. That piece is kind of key though, because not all the city overlies this critical basin to which the city has this pretty importantly protected water right. I've built this box out here to highlight where within the city, these are the real focus target areas, especially for the ones that are getting LADWP funding. And as you can see, this area of the Eastern San Fernando Valley is a little bit of a ways away from a lot of the neighborhoods that we think of as more iconic LA, downtown, West Side, this. This is an area that's relatively peripheral. And also, as you can see in a lot of the environmental justice literature from LA, tends to be more polluted in its air and soil due to the large concentration of freeways and also industrial facilities, and also is home primarily to low-income communities of color. And so you have a case where environmental justice concerns, questions are obviously salient if you're going to be trying to put a lot of new infrastructure into one concentrated area with these characteristics. And so a lot of proponents of these approaches within water districts and within environmental organizations really focus on the advantages, the ecosystem services, the benefits that these infrastructures bring to communities. And I think these are really salient because a lot of times these are areas that do not have enough greenery, tree cover, other kind of key benefits and key amenities that we would hope that all communities would share equally. But an important point is this kind of push to build out green infrastructure to help the whole city have this storage in this below ground basin. Sometimes it'll be funded to build out the infrastructure, but the ongoing maintenance typically is not. And so it's something we need to think through when we're talking about building out storage and giving communities amenities, is the reality that we're also often passing along a burden of labor to communities that are not shared equally across the city. And so I'm not saying this to suggest that, oh, these are not infrastructures that bring good, oh, we shouldn't use this technique, but just to highlight the complication and unevenness of pursuing storage for a city like Los Angeles. And so this is about where I will stop here. This talk was based on a paper that includes two other much more sprawling case studies that go beyond the borders of the city. And I can talk more about those in the Q&A if everyone would like. But for now, I'll leave it there. And thank you guys so much.
Thanks so much. Sadie, if you can actually, I love that paper that you just kind of showed that last slide of. So if you can drop that link for our folks here in the audience, that would be great. It's a wonderful case study. Thank you. Great. So next, I have the pleasure of introducing Edgar Telles-Foster, who is an economist currently working as a water resources management and planning director for the Chino Basin Water Master, and is also serving as adjunct assistant professor of environmental economics at UC Riverside. So in addition to his water management experience, Dr. Telles-Foster has intimate knowledge of water. I thought this was great, so I hope it's okay to talk about this. I found it online. As a young boy in a poor area in Mexico City, he often experienced water shortages, which really fueled his interest in environmental issues. He later attended the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where he was able to integrate his interest in environmental problems with a growing understanding in the role of economic systems. And he eventually received a PhD in environmental and resource economics and policy from UC Riverside. So Dr. Telles-Foster's scholarship is focused on groundwater economics, behavioral economics, and experimental economics. We are so fortunate to have him with us today. Thank you for being here, and I'll turn the spotlight over to you so you can share some of your work with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation and the introduction. I can assure you that it sounds more impressive than it really is. So I appreciate it. And let me just start sharing my screen so I can start talking a little bit about the topic that I wanted to introduce to you today. And this is very well integrated to what we heard earlier with Greg's and Dr. Randall's talk. And this is how we have been able to protect disadvantaged communities during drought periods in the Chino Basin. So first, let me locate you where we are. The Chino Basin is located in Southern California. This is a little map that shows where in the state we are located. We are located within the Santa Ana River watershed, which is the longest self-contained river in the state of California. And we are actually in between 3 counties. So the Chino Basin is in between LA County, San Bernardino County, and Riverside County, which makes it a very interesting arrangement for governance and cooperation. So within the Chino Basin, this is a more broader map that shows where we are actually located. We also border with Orange County, so that's another interesting neighbor we have to the south. So within the Chino Basin, we have large parts of disadvantaged communities that depend on the groundwater and the surface water that flows through the basin. And this is a region that in the past decade has experienced tremendous growth, both in terms of population and in terms of industrial and logistics development. So as you can see in this map of the basin, we have very, very large parts of the basin that are considered disadvantaged communities by the state's regulations and the state's parameters. So the Chino Basin really is the source of water for about 1.5 million people. And as I said, it has experienced tremendous growth. And one of the things that Dr. Randall was pointing out is with urbanization and growth comes the fact that we need to evacuate water from the urban areas faster because we don't want the areas to be flooded and we have to protect life and property. So we have an ever-growing system of concrete line channels that hinder the ability of the basin to be replenished. And this was happening from the 50s all the way to the 90s where we developed this. You can see them here in the map. All those blue lines in there are concrete line channels that flow through the basin. So a little bit of why I titled the presentation Protecting Disadvantaged Communities during Drought. We all know a little bit of the economics of drought. Water is a commodity, whether we like it or not. It behaves as a commodity. When it's scarce, prices go up. And because it behaves as any other commodity, and in this system, scarcity leads to higher pricing. Higher pricing leads to communities that are left behind because they can't afford the resource. And oftentimes during drought, we are encouraged to conserve water, which is a good thing. But the way we are setting up our rate structures often lead to rate increases following conservation measures, right? Because revenues from these entities that provide water fall, and there's infrastructure that needs to be maintained, and therefore rates have to increase. So drought has distributed consequences. It affects more those that are already disadvantaged. Now, what has been happening here in the Chino Basin? So the Chino Basin is a big groundwater basin, one of the largest in Southern California. And during the preceding years to 1978, there was historic drought in California, particularly in Southern California. So this led to the groundwater users to get together and figure out how they can share the resource. And I'm not saying that they all got together in a room, share a couple of pizzas and talk. They actually were fighting in court on how are we going to distribute these competitive and scarce resources. They finally reached an agreement, and the court in 1978 issued the adjudication judgment for the Chino Basin that basically divided the water rights in the basin. After 20 years of managing the basin, there were some issues like land subsidence and land fissuring, decreasing water levels, and some pollution issues that again made the stakeholders get together and say, well, are we really managing these resources the best we can? So they got together, and in 1998, the court again issued another order for them to develop an optimum basin management program. This program is very similar to what we know now under SGMA as a groundwater sustainability plan, a GSP. So this program, the development of this program was concluded in 2000. Okay. Just as a note, the 2014 SGMA, or Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, was also enacted after historic drought. And I'm gonna come back to that point later, because it was a drought that gave us the Chino Basin judgment and the Optimum Basin Management Program. It was also a drought that pushed the state to enact legislation to regulate groundwater uses. So the Chino Basin has been implementing a sustainable groundwater or an Optimum Basin Management Program, which is a sustainable management plan type of program, for almost 20 years. And during those 20 years, the Chino Basin Collective has invested close to $500 million in infrastructure maintenance and operation of different programs to improve the resiliency and the reliability of the groundwater supply in the region. So in turn, what this has led us is to weather the droughts better, meaning we are in a better position to provide water to these disadvantaged communities that I showed you earlier, without the risk of leaving people behind or having to dramatically increase our water rates, and also decrease the dependence on imported water. Chino Basin, we fulfill our water needs about 60% from local resources, 40% from imported. But we can, that's an operational decision, but we can really increase that ratio to depend more on local resources. So this Optimum Basin Management Program that I've been talking to you about, and this is part of why these disadvantaged communities don't suffer from water scarcity or higher prices as much as other regions in the Southern California area. It really focuses on these four main pillars, which is improving our recharge infrastructure, managing land subsidence, managing salt in the groundwater basin, and implementing desalting capacities. So this is a bird's eye view of the Chino Basin and our recharge infrastructure throughout the basin. And this is a picture from the 2013 Recharge Master Plan update. It was this big update happened in 2013. Then we had another much smaller in scope update in 2018. And you can see we have a lot of recharge infrastructure. This infrastructure existed there first and foremost to avoid flooding. So most of these basins were what we call retention basins, not recharge basins. And the difference is a retention basin is there for the flood control district to just get the water in while the channel is busy, and then get the water out. And they just don't want the water flooding and destroying property or causing loss of lives. We have been able to work with the county's flood control district and other entities to improve and operate these retention basins as recharge basins. So our recharge capacity improved dramatically from the 90s, where we lost a lot of that to the concrete line channels. Now we are about the same recharge capacity as we were before we lined those channels. So we're there in protecting the basin in that sense. And what I'm going to show you next is how the stored water in the basin has been increasing over the years, even throughout drought periods. So what you're looking at is our accounting of the storage accounts in the Chino Basin and how they have been increasing throughout the years, in part due to the increase in recharge capacity, in part also due to the ability to desalt water. We have 2 big desalter plants, and the ability, because of that salt management in the basin, to reuse and recharge recycled water here. So those factors have allowed the basin to improve the resiliency and improve the reliability of the local resource. This is a graph that is showing you how we have been able to start recharging not only imported water or local water, but also start recharging recycled water, which is a big part of what we use in the portfolio of water resources in the basin. And this is another graph that shows how much of this recycled water is going to direct use for irrigation, for parks, for other indirect uses, and how much of it is going to recharge. Why is this important? The fact that we are handling the salt and nutrients in the basin the way we're doing, and with the great relationship we have with the regional board, it allows us to not only recharge that recycled water, but also have that recycled water be used indirectly for other uses that otherwise we will need to either pump water from the aquifer or import water. And this last slide that I have in here is just a comparison of our estimation of the investments that the region has made in infrastructure and the development of these programs and the benefits that we have reaped from those investments. We are about $200 million of net benefits from those investments, and that's not even counting for other things like the ability to transfer water between entities within the Chino Basin. There's a very active market of water rights and water in storage between the stakeholders. That cumulative transfer accounts for almost 800,000 acre feet. The cumulative water produced by the Chino Desalting Authority, which is the authority, is a JPA created by the Chino Basin stakeholders to operate the 2 big desalter plants that provide potable water from the Chino Basin that otherwise was not able to be served to customers because of the amount of salt in it. It's about 500,000 acre feet also, the cumulative production. So that's another resource that we were able to untap to serve the disadvantaged communities that otherwise were suffering from water quality issues. We have been able to recharge about 500,000 acre feet of water through our dry year yield program with Metropolitan Water District. This is a program that brings water into the basin when the water is plentiful. Think about 2017, 2019. And that water is pumped in lieu of imported water when the State Water Project doesn't have enough water for us. We have also avoided conflict due to water quality, avoided conflict due to land subsidence, improved resiliency to drought, And we have been able to handle and almost arrest the land subsidence that was happening in the northeast, northwest part of the Chino Basin, and that's the Pomona Montclair area. So that's not quite where Cal Poly is, but it's close to Cal Poly. So what are the lessons that we have learned from almost more than 40 years of fights and arrangements and settlements and court orders and all that complex management of these local resources? So first, that the investments made by the collective have paid off very much. Second, when we invest in local resources and we invest in improving the resiliency and reliability of these local resources, those investments protect disadvantaged communities. Therefore, we are able to diminish the impact, the distributive impacts of drought to these disadvantaged communities. Another thing is that droughts are terrible, but they are also good opportunities to implement new solutions, innovative solutions that otherwise would have not been able to occur. And fourth is, and this is something that Greg's talk reminded me of all the fragmentation of governance of water. In the Chino Basin, we have all those types of water providers. We have special districts, we have private mutual companies, we have cities and municipalities. However, the cooperation amongst all of them, managing these competitive resource and managing it in a cooperative manner has benefited everyone. Not only those that traditionally, because of the system, have benefited from water, but also these disadvantaged communities that traditionally have been left behind. So I hope that you were not expecting a doom and gloom presentation. I like to bring a little bit of good news too, and I think this is a good example of management.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. A success story. Thank you, everyone. So again, I just want to invite you all to put your questions in the chat. We have about 30 minutes now. So let me just start us off with a couple of questions that I have that came up as you all presented your work. So Greg, let me start with you. I have a two-part question. So you mentioned that each different water system has different priorities and different interests, let's say, in providing water that are also sometimes an obstacle in achieving similar equity objectives. So I was curious if you could speak a little bit about what those differences are and what impact they have on access to water. And then you also mentioned something about scale that struck me, that among smaller systems, you have different levels of risk of, falling out of water quality compliance, but with smaller systems, they're particularly failing to provide high quality water. So I was just curious to hear your thoughts on why.
Great, thanks. I'll try to tackle both. I think the second is perhaps easier. There's a lot of the reason that smaller systems struggle to provide high quality water is about what people in the water industry are now calling TMF, technical managerial financial capacity, and not being able to realize the economies of scale for particularly like the most sophisticated treatment that's needed to address all the contaminants that are regulated and are going to be regulated soon. And it's only going to get worse in terms of emerging contaminants, things like PFAS, hexavalent, chromium, that are going to be obligations of systems to address, but aren't quite yet. But it's also, I think, related to the accessibility dimension as well, because the smallest systems are almost universally reliant on a single source. So just when that single source gets contaminated or is contaminated, particularly if it's groundwater, which it almost always is, they just don't have other options except linking in to larger agreements and sources like, Edgar focused on, which is happening, but it's not happening and doesn't happen as easily for the small systems. Back to your first question, it was really about priorities, not differences in capacity.
Yeah, you mentioned, now correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned that different water systems have different priorities, but also different interests, you said in passing, in providing water that tend to be obstacles in achieving similar equity objectives.
Yeah, so I guess trying to think of how to talk to this concisely, but I mean, I think the easiest one to address is around affordability, where you have different types of systems. I mean, some are investor-owned utilities. They're mandated, or their end goal is to provide a return to shareholders. And so they need to make a profit, and they're mandated to make a profit, whereas other types of systems, particularly city-owned, county-run, can't make a profit, are obligated not to do that. So there's definitely different interests there. And I think affordability is the clearest one where there's just different objectives. Because I do want to say, I mean, every drinking water system is formed to provide, sufficient quantity of accessible water, and I'm sure every system wants to provide safe water, but its capacity to do so, and yeah, its interest in doing so at a certain price does vary quite a bit.
Yeah. All right, thank you. So let me move on to, I just have one question for each of you, and then I'll turn to the audience. But Sadie, I've been thinking recently a lot about some of the resilience plans that many communities at different scales put out. And that's coming from my interest from urban design, right? Envisioning these climate just futures and the nature-based solutions that go with that. And I found, the question that always keeps coming up, and many community members, as you're probably aware of, is this question of labor involved in maintaining some of these landscapes. They're often disguised, at least in resilience plans, the word is stewardship, right? We have stewardship of landscapes, urban or otherwise, and they're especially prominent calls when it comes to nature-based solutions, right? Because the maintenance of those would likely rely not on engineers, but on the citizens. I know you've done a bit of work on this. I'm hoping you can speak to this a little bit if it's something that's come up in your case studies and its impact on some of the populations that you're most concerned with, of course, these being communities already considered having been historically disinvested from.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak a bit about the labor piece, which I think is really crucial. And I think I might try and follow Edgar's example and give a bit of the most hopeful angle on this, which is these are arrangements that could quite plausibly, through the idiom of stewardship, through this focus on what the community is going to do to maintain these projects, like really redistribute a lot of work for free to communities. However, that piece isn't inevitable. And as this growing recognition that if we're going to rely on more natural systems or nature-based solutions, that entails a lot of work, there are opportunities to make that work that pays. It is not something that our current institutions, particularly our public municipal institutions, are especially well suited to providing at this stage, but that's not inevitable. There can be new roles, there can be new trainings, and this also could be an opportunity for an emergent green industry. I think in Southern California, when we're thinking about maintenance of a basic residential landscape, the sort of cliche idea of the mow, blow, and go operations, people who work for very little money to do a kind of basic flattening of grass and maintaining the landscape in that scale. Again, another piece that's not inevitable, with appropriate training, maybe focused in community colleges or other kind of institutions that could provide a certificate. This could be something that would be a value add for companies to be able to offer. If it's a residential property that's taking this on, perhaps, be able to offer that service as a company. I realize I'm getting into the territory of extremely bourgeois middle class kind of maintenance, right? Like most people in this region do not have the disposable income to hire anybody to maintain part of their property. But I guess I would say that there are these risks of us redistributing this labor and making it a free thing. And I think that, first of all, there are other routes where we could find ways to better value this labor, and there are kind of work pipelines that could be very promising for this. And second, I guess my only ambivalence in talking this way is that I don't want to undersell the very real pleasure and affective benefit that a lot of people do take from doing this kind of stewardship. And so while taking seriously that it is work, I also want to kind of say that in a way that respects the groups that are trying to do this in a way that is meaningful and can become meaningful for people. So I guess I'm just like trying to nod towards the complexity of it while saying that maybe there are better pathways to getting this work done and paid for as these kinds of infrastructures spread further.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. And then my last question for Edgar. So your last slide pointed to this investment of close to 200 million, I think it was just under $200 million in water infrastructure. So I was just curious if you could speak a little bit to what changes to the built environment you did in order to get your levels of recharge and storage to increase, which you showed in a previous slide, and back to those previous levels. And were there any complications in really implementing those projects or thinking about where those strategies should be distributed, where they're placed in relationship to certain communities, certain populations?
Yes, so part of the investments that stem from the program, and I'm going to speak to three main branches of these investments. The first one was the recharge branch, and for the recharge, we were very lucky to be able to work with the San Bernardino Flood Control District to get into an agreement to use the facilities that they already had with minimal improvements. And I say minimal because, it's to build a recharge basin, it's a big endeavor. You need very large swaths of land. You have to, so when I say minimal, it was a lot of work, but not so much as to build a groundwater recharge basin from scratch. So we were able to work with them to improve those previously retention basins, to turn them into recharge basins, and they allow us to operate them. Of course, they have first priority of use. That's out of the question. And if they tell us you have to evacuate the water, we evacuate the water. But having that relationship with them and being able to use those facilities to recharge has had a tremendous impact on our ability to recharge water into the basin. So that was the first branch of investment. The second was the desalter capacity. So I didn't go into too much detail, but let me just very quickly. The southern part of the basin had salt problems. And because the legacy activities in the southern part of the basin were mostly agricultural activities. And as those activities started to decline over the years, the pumping also declined. So water was flowing from the northern part of the basin to the river, to the Santa Ana River, and eventually showing up in Orange County. When flowing through that southern part of the basin, it picked a lot of the nitrogen and salt. So we had a problem there because not only we were losing water to the river, but also the water that was showing up in the river was high in salts and nitrogen. So what we did is we built a picket fence, if you want to visualize it like that, of wells in the southern part of the basin that substituted that legacy pumping from the ag activities. And that water, high in salts and nitrogen, is sent to the two desalter plants where it's treated, and now that is potable, served to customers throughout the Chino Basin. And the investment for that was about $500 million from various entities, including the state and some federal grants and all that. And then the third branch was the management of land subsidence, which is also help from the recharge capacity that we have, because we are able to increase water levels. We have observed subsidence and have been able to arrest land subsidence in the areas where previously we had problems with that. So those basically were the three avenues that we invested in water infrastructure to really be able to serve the entire Chino Basin.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Edgar. All right, so let me see here. Matthew has a question. Do you think if households start to incorporate gray water systems to irrigate their lawn/garden beds for water or water for toilet or laundry can help improve the available clean quality water needed to support populations? Does anyone want to tackle that?
I can give an initial answer. I'm interested to hear from fellow panelists, but I guess I would start with saying positively, yes, that can make a difference, and there needs to be conservation everywhere, including especially among higher income, typically households who are using a lot of water outdoors. But I'd also say, I mean, functionally right now, even if those households are doing that, there's not a mechanism, again, to transfer, especially to other households served by other systems that are small. There's not a physical mechanism. That's quite expensive, and there's not, again, a governance mechanism. So that's still an obstacle that we're seeing in multiple parts of the state, although I do see more large water systems that are conserving starting to find ways to get around that. But I also, I mean, I think something important to mention, and apologies if it was already mentioned, but in terms of the water use in the state and conservation, the biggest change we need to see is still in agriculture, which uses 80% of the water in the state. I'm not saying that all of that water needs to go to other purposes, but there's a lot more room in terms of increasing water supply to be gotten from efficiency in ag than in the residential space. So I don't want it to be perceived that it's all up to households to cut. I think we need to cut, but really the big gains can come from other places.
Indeed. Okay. Yes, everyone's agreeing that ag industry is another big factor. Yeah, there was a question previously as well, might be related to agriculture and fertilizer use. Why is there so much salt? Maybe I'll turn to Edgar for this one.
Yeah, in our case, the southern part of the basin traditionally had high concentrations of salt and nitrogen, and that's related to the legacy activities that happened there. I mean, the Chino Basin was very famous for its berries, for its agricultural products too, like some citrus. Some in the northern part we had large extensions of grapevines and wine production. So yeah, it is related to that. Also, some of it is naturally occurring. That's just geology. So both of those factors combined, contribute to concentrations of salt, especially in that southern part of the basin.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Sadie, in your presentation, you mentioned a little bit, maybe you said focus on the Q&A about the pollution that's in the ground there in your particular case study. That's part of your ecologically complex question versus having, the above ground storage.
Yeah, absolutely. So the San Fernando Basin I was speaking about is actually an enormous Superfund site. It was identified as such in the 1980s and is still not fully cleaned up. I think you guys remember one of the slides I put that had a lot of wells on a map. Some were green, some were red. The red were ones that were taken offline because they've become too polluted to be drawing the water from. And I think it's an interesting it's like a lot of environmental stories in the US, unfortunately, that a large part of the reason it's been so hard to do effective cleanup is that this was a super distributed pollution situation. Lots of small unregulated firms kind of popped up and were, having a dry cleaners, having a gas station, not storing things as effectively as they might, and then they would leach into the groundwater. And so it's been this very long, slow situation of finding the money from different sources to do the cleanup. And there not being, in most cases, one kind of big player that you can target, and not an Aaron Brockovich type story. So it highlights the complexity of, like, as we turn to groundwater, that these, one of the advantages of an area like the Eastern San Fernando Valley is built into the landscape itself. It's rocky, it's porous, like a lot of stuff kind of goes through it and gets into the aquifer. Great for recharging the basin with water, unfortunately also great for getting a whole lot of other things into it. And so it's just a little more complicated when we're starting to think through the subterranean as this new sort of like valued space for water, because it's, kind of complicated down there. And then you have Elon Musk going to build tunnels. And so, only going to get more complicated.
Great. Thank you for that. So with the time that I have left, I was wondering if each of you maybe have questions for each other. I know that your work is definitely in conversation with one another, so I'll just open it up to you.
So I think I have a question for both my fellow speakers, and how do you see the role of governance in really improving in Greg's case, he was talking about the disparity of rates, right? How can we improve those issues in the case of Dr. Randall? How can we better cooperate? I know the San Fernando Basin is really complex because of the judgment in the relationship with the city of LA and all that. So what do you see the role of governance in those very complex issues? And if you have a suggestion on improving that governance?
I can say a few things, and specifically, I think mostly focusing on affordability here because that's what you mentioned. But I guess the first in terms of governance is broadly around consolidation, integration of some, again, not all of the smaller systems that are out there. I don't think, I don't want to give the impression that all small systems are performing poorly, because that's not true, and many of them are performing just fine. But in terms of where the problems lie, there's a concentration there. But with respect to affordability, I think governance can play a big role, and there's two big things, maybe three. I mean, one is that systems can continue to change their rates, which they have done, to be more progressive and charge people more for higher levels of consumption that are discretionary as opposed to essential. The other two big reforms, though, that we need to see are leveling the playing field at the state level, which is currently prohibiting public utilities from providing affordability support as opposed to private utilities, which is just bizarre and perverse. And plenty of people have identified it, but there's also political resistance to that change. And I think a final way that we need to see governance reform, it's really been highlighted by the pandemic, is around preventing shutoffs and relieving debt that people hold on their utility accounts. And that's not just water, that's definitely energy as well. But I think we have seen reform. We're just coming out of an era where there's been a moratorium on shutoffs, and I'm hopeful that we'll get to at least a better place than we were before the moratorium, where we were shutting off literally hundreds of thousands of households in the state. But we have a little ways to go there. So I'll stop there and pass it over to Sadie.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think I have as useful of a point on how we might improve governance, but I guess I did want to explicitly raise something that's been maybe a little implicit in the discussion so far, which is that studying City of LA and entities like the LADWP for so long has really highlighted for me that there's a problem, and Greg's work speaks to this so well, in the way that in California we'll talk about like an urban and rural binary in terms of water governance, because the urban is so fragmented and the economies of scale that come with these large water districts make places like the City of LA, the Metropolitan Water District, which is a different kind of entity, but then also the San Diego County Water Authority, able to do things on such a radically different scale that you're starting the patchworks that are emerging even now within urban regions of water quality, water cost, water access. It strikes me as something that's only going to accelerate going forward as some of these enormous infrastructural investments roll out with the larger entities. And I think we really need to keep an eye on that aspect of the picture and kind of like avoid the urban rural binary as much as possible, because there is like such crucial differentiation within really urbanized regions. So yeah, and I'll give my questions for the two of you now, which is I'm really curious to hear, Edward, looking forward, kind of like what are the next big things on the horizon? Like California is entering another drought right now. Are there things you haven't spoken about that the district is planning to kind of double down on, or new directions? And then, gosh, Greg, I have so many questions I would love to ask you about this work, but if you have any space for it, I'd love to hear a bit more about mobile home parks as a unit of governance and what some of your early findings on those are, because they're not part of all too many water governance discussions, and they're really important units of where people live within this region.
Yeah, I can start by speaking about where we see things going. And one of the things we did back in 2019 is an update to our optimum basin management program. So the update was adopted by our board in October 2020, and this update identified some of the opportunities and some of the threats for the region. And within the opportunities is how can we expand our storage program to maybe create a water bank, to maybe create opportunities for entities outside of the Chino Basin to come and store water here. Fortunately, although we have some water quality concerns, the Chino Basin is prime real estate for groundwater storage. And we have the capacity in the basin to store more water than what we currently do. So that's an area of opportunity that we're exploring. And the second, which is a threat, is both climate change and how the availability of imported water is going to decline. And we are also going to have this, as you mentioned, the feast and famine sort of a scenario, right? Where we're going to have years with a lot of rain and years with zero allocation. And also the emerging contaminants has been an issue that we have been focusing on, like PFAS, like hexchromium and other new constituents that have been identified in that as our lab capacity and lab detection limits start to improve, we're going to be able to find these constituents in our water, and what are we going to do about that, right? So those are the things where the next 20 years of groundwater management are going to take us, and that's what we're envisioning.
Yeah, and thanks for asking about mobile home parks. One of my favorite topics to talk about. I know I only have a few minutes, but I would just say briefly, well, mobile home parks face drinking water access issues, they face sanitation issues, they face fire and heat exposure issues. And so there's cross-cutting concerns, but with respect to drinking water, I think there's approximately 3,000 to 4,000 mobile home parks in the state. Most of them are connected to larger water systems. but even they face obstacles because of landlords either not paying bills or not managing the on-site infrastructure. That's the responsibility of whoever the property owner is. But then there are, among the 3,000 drinking water systems, 500 are sort of mobile home park run, and they face, yeah, source issues plus all of the other issues. I think that we talked about in terms of the human right to water, most acutely, I think the two answers there, first and foremost, is this consolidation, especially of mobile home park run water systems that are literally a donut within a larger water system, which there's several hundred of. But the other is, I think, has to be addressed through broader strategies, again, for parks like community ownership models, because without a change in owner or manager and without addressing the other environmental hazard and sort of exposure issues, you're really not yet addressing all the environmental justice concerns that communities face. So, and I would just note again, mobile home parks, it's a run water systems, an issue in LA, an issue in California, but it's even bigger elsewhere where mobile home parks are more prevalent as a form of affordable housing.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. We do unfortunately have to wrap up. I just want to ask everyone to join me in thanking our esteemed panelists. The expertise and insights that they brought to this conversation was fantastic. So thank you, Greg and Sadie and Edgar, for being here. Really appreciate it. All right, folks.
Thank you.
Thank yous.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Really wonderful presentation.